Cities have been clear. We cannot slash services right now, nor can we or should we massively raise taxes to help cover these costs. It would take a 47% hike in property taxes to raise $1.5 billion, the amount that we are presently short due to the pandemic. This is just not practical or fair to the citizens of Toronto who pay those taxes. Unlike the other governments, we also cannot run a deficit, a long-standing and good restriction for municipal governments who don't hold the same revenue tools as the other levels of government. Now, I'm encouraged by the positive comments from the most senior federal and provincial leaders last week, and I understand discussions have been ongoing between those two governments. But we have yet to hear in any city across the country, including Toronto, a financial commitment or even the beginnings of discussions leading to a financial commitment. This jeopardizes the ability of all cities to continue to respond to the COVID-19 emergency and to help form a stable foundation at the same time in those cities across the country, including Toronto, for the local economic restart and recovery. Strong cities built strong economies across this country before the pandemic, and strong cities are going to be needed to rebuild and restart provincial economies and our national economy after this emergency. Toronto is Canada's economic engine. We are ready to rev up, but we cannot stall. That is exactly what is at risk if the federal and provincial governments don't come to the table with funding support for Toronto and for all Canadian municipalities. Without immediate support, our city, like many other cities across Canada, in fact, I think without exception, cities across Canada, is facing unprecedented cuts that will hurt this city and every person and every business that the federal and provincial governments have been trying to help over the last weeks since this pandemic began. City staff are working to find savings. We find millions of dollars in savings every year, and we're hard at work identifying savings right now. But even with prudent, sensible steps to reduce costs that don't reduce services, we would still need support from the other governments. But as the year goes on, we also have to plan for what would happen if we don't get that support, if no support is forthcoming. And that increases the magnitude of the cuts that have to be made to services because you're further along in the year, but the number that we're short doesn't itself go away. City staff have calculated what would have to be cut if the province and the federal government take no action to help us. And I thought it was fair that I should share the magnitude of those kinds of service reductions. I mentioned the tax increase previously. I thought it was fair I should share the magnitude of those service increases with you. I find these cuts completely unacceptable. Unacceptable even to contemplate, but it's the reality of where we sit today. I don't know how we can contemplate cuts to our services, though, when we are at a time when you, the people of the City of Toronto and people in cities across Canada, need those services the most. I believe it is important for everyone, especially Toronto residents and residents of the GTA who rely on Toronto and stable local finances in their own cities, to know how terrible and devastating these cuts would be, like nothing we've ever seen, if the other governments don't decide to step forward and invest in the well-being of our cities. Preliminary City of Toronto cost containment measures to generate savings this year to make up for the $1.5 billion would likely include the following: a $575 million reduction to TTC service, just as we try to maintain service levels to support physical distancing as much as we possibly can. This would basically require a 50% shutdown of the entire TTC service. Now, you may not know what a 50% shutdown of the TTC service would look like. Well, it would look like service on Line 1 and Line 2 of the subway would be cut in half. Line 3 in Scarborough and Line 4 in North York, the Shepherd Line, would be shut down entirely. All streetcar service levels, including King, Queen, and St. Clair, would be cut in half. Streetcars would come only every 10 to 20 minutes. Major bus service levels, including Jane, Dufferin, Steeles, Finch, they would be cut in half. Service would operate every 10 to 20 minutes. There would be a $73.6 million reduction in Wheel-Trans service. That would cut more than 4 million Wheel-Trans rides. Toronto Fire Services, which has seen an increase in fires this year, it would see more than a $23 million reduction. In the case of the Toronto Police Service, they would see a $31.3 million budget cut that would eliminate 500 frontline officers. An unacceptable reduction just after we worked so hard in our budget with the police service to hire those same officers to try and help us to fight gun violence. We would be forced to eliminate almost $40 million in childcare subsidies. This would lead to the elimination of 40,625 childcare subsidies to families living in the City of Toronto. Just as we have expanded our shelter services, you've heard us talk about that throughout the pandemic in order to help with physical distancing, we would have to cut our shelter budget by $101.5 million. This would lead to a 50% reduction in the shelter spaces added. Our recreational programs would see a $40.8 million reduction. That represents a 50% reduction in recreational services and the closure of 61 community centres and/or the loss of 600,000 hours of recreational programming. Long-term care would see a 50% reduction in spaces in the residences we own in order to save $12 million. And that would lead to the elimination of approximately 1,320 spaces in our long-term care residences. Library branches would have to be closed. The subsidy for Toronto community housing would have to be reduced. And new investments made just this year, just in the 2020 budget, in the last few weeks, only a few weeks ago, in youth hubs and youth spaces set to open in September of this year to help us address the roots of gun violence in our city, those would have to be cancelled. Without support, the city would be forced to consider putting as many as 19,184 employees out of work. That would be 19,184 more people out of work, regardless of who they work for. We can't afford to have those kinds of numbers of people put out of work any more than we have out of work already. It will hurt those individuals and their families, but it will also further devastate the GTA economy. Capital projects would also see a $451 million reduction, including critical capital and transit projects slated for this year. Those capital projects, as you know, they create jobs and they help drive economic prosperity, something we know not just for the sake of this city, but for the sake of the entire country will be absolutely necessary in the coming year. We would be left with a city that can't work, and it would be unable to keep helping the people who rely on that help the most. I have been working nonstop to bring this to the attention of the other governments and to secure their funding commitments, and that work will continue. I said the other day on television, I've had a lot of encouraging words, but encouraging words don't buy childcare, and they don't buy transit service, and they don't buy help for the homeless people. They don't buy anything, quite frankly.